This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to the Lech Dech Musar podcast. We continue with Pirkei Avos, Parak Aleph. We're in the middle of Mishnah Tes, the tail end of Mishnah Tes. We'll just read over the whole Mishnah again. Shimon Meshetach Omer Havi Marba Lachar Sa'idim. We spoke about this last year. V'vizar b'dvarecha shema mitoicham yilmedu l'shaker. Sounds like very simple, straightforward, one-dimensional words. That if you're dying, be careful with your words because the litigants can learn from them to lie. But we always have to understand, as we always do, what does this have to do with us? So Rav Wolbe opens up a whole yesod in how this pertains to each and every person. Shimon ben Shetach's second directive is not only telling us the Pasha Pshat, that we should be extra cautious during interrogation to ensure that the numerous questions do not inadvertently hint to the witness the direction he needs to take to have the testimony accepted, as we said before. But, says Rav Wolbe, we must be extra careful with what you say and do when you are in the presence of your children or students, lest they begin copying undesirable speech or behavior. Even when one has a valid justification for acting or speaking in a certain manner, it is unlikely that his children or students will comprehend the rationale of his behavior. Thus, they will emulate the behavior even when the justification is absent. So says Rav Wolbe, what does it mean? V'havizar b'dvarecha. Be very diligent in your words, because even when you understand something, the circumstances in your mind, in your heart, it's all worked out. But when you're in the presence of others, your children, this is a lesson for chinuch. That your children aren't necessarily always going to understand those circumstances, the situation. And even when you have a valid justification in your head, it doesn't mean, and it's likely not the case, that others are going to understand it. So you have to be zahir. Always realize that you're under the light, that you're being investigated, you're being looked at, you're being watched. You're a role model, and we're all role models to our friends, to our families, to our children, to whoever it is. This is the aside of Rav Wolbe. Havizar b'dvarecha. Be careful with your words, because Shema mitoichem yilmedu l'shaker. Others are going to learn to lie, to be deceitful, not to speak nicely from your actions. But then Rav Wolbe takes it a step further. He says the truth is that this idea applies not only to families and to friends, to your children, but it applies to all interpersonal relationships. What does it mean? If one fails to practice what he preaches, he could very well be undermining everything that he claims to stand for. And therefore, says Rav Wolbe, our Gedolim were always extra careful about what they demanded from others. To live up to, Havizar b'dvarecha. When you have a davar, when you preach something, when you say something, be very zahir, very vigilant, and adhere to those words, because Shema mitoichem yilmedu l'shaker. People are going to call you out. People are going to say you're a living steer, you're a contradiction. How can it be? You just said do this and now you're doing that. And people aren't going to understand you. And ultimately it's going to be a chilul Hashem. And if we're not ready to preach, because it doesn't really resonate with us and we are not really practicing it, and we should think twice before we say what we may want to say. To this point, Rav Wolbe quotes an incredible story that happened with Reb Yerucham Levovitz. At one point, all of the Bachrim in Yeshiva were occupied with an extremely difficult statement made by the Rambam. No one was able to come up with a viable explanation for what he had written. After a while, a certain Bachar came over with a brilliant solution and immediately became the star of the yeshiva. The Mashgiach, Reb Yerucham Levovitz, called the Bachar over and asked him, how long did it take you to prepare to work on that beautiful, brilliant pshat in the Rambam? The Bachar said 5 hours. It took me a whole 5 hours to work on this pshat. Reb Yerucham then looked at this Bachar and said, let me ask you something. How long do you think it took me to prepare the last Mussar Shmuz I recently gave in yeshiva? And the Bachar looked at Reb Yerucham and said, probably around the same time, 5 hours, 6, 7. Rucham nodded no. The Bach offered maybe 10, and Rucham continued, no. The Bach said, a day? And again, no. A week? A month? At this point, he wasn't sure where Rucham was going with this. More than a month. And Rucham said, not a week, not a month, not 2 months. 6 months it took me to prepare that shmuz. A half a year went into the preparation of that Sichas Musar. Says Rav Wolbe, why did Rabbi Rucham, what was the significance, the importance? Was Rabbi Rucham there to brag? To undermine that the Bach only spent 5 hours on his pshat? His oimik in the Rambam? No. What Rabbi Rucham was trying to convey, in light and to the point of the Musar he gave. He accepted this Bach's brilliant answer, the Yishuv and the Rambam, but he wanted to tell him another message. And that is that before imparting, giving over any wisdom to the Klal, to the Talmidim, Rabbi Rucham would not preach anything that he himself could not live up to. And therefore it took him 6 months to ensure that he practiced all that he was going to preach. 6 months, Rabbi Rucham had the idea, he had the wisdom and the musar to impart to the Talmidim. But until he was for certain that it was part of his life, that it was processed and a real part of his Mahalach HaChaim, he wasn't going to give it over to others until it was an emes in himself. That's what the Mishnah means. V'havizar b'dvarecha. Be careful with your words. Make sure that they're not just fluff. They're not empty words of nothingness. Make sure that they're substantial. Make sure that they're emistic. Make sure that you internalize them before giving them over to others. Why? Because says the Mishnah, Shema mitoichem yilmudu l'sheker. People are going to have a distorted, misconstrued, warped vision. They're going to say, this is what you said, but this is what you're doing. I don't understand. And instead of making more kavod shemayim in the world, there's going to be more chil shemayim, chas v'shalom. Only when something is emistic, when something is real by you, can you give it over to others? Should you give it over to others? Can you help others live an elevated and enriched life? But until then, Rabbi Rucham sat 6 months until he lived and inculcated the musar that he wanted to give over to the Talmidim, to himself. And we too, when we have something to say over to others, to preach in a good way, in a positive way, to help others, to be mechazek and uplift them, we must make sure that first it resides and it's part of our lives, it's part of our talich. That's part of our lives, and only then can we give it over to others. But if we have them right, if we are zar b'dvarecha, we make sure that they are a part of our lives, we identify with them, we see their truth, then mitoicham yilmudu la'emes. It will be given over to others with truth, with clarity, and really uplift and help people come closer to Kadosh Baruch Hu and be marbe shchina and kavod shemayim in this world.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.